In this lecture, we'll look at an overview of incident response. In particular, we'll cover the definition of what constitutes an incident, and we'll look at various types of incidents. For example, you found a Trojan or some type of malware on your network or a particular computer. You've had a network intrusion, or you've had an insider being able to access information that they shouldn't be. All of these constitutes what we call an intrusion. However, we don't handle them the same way. We'll also look at the incident response capability. Incident response should be something that you plan for, because you will have an incident if you're a network or security administrator. You can count on that. But you need to have a plan in place that tells you exactly what you need to do in order to overcome the incident and to learn from the incident. So those are some of the things that we'll be looking at today.
First of all, describe 3 different terms that you'll need to be familiar with in order to understand some of the terminology that we talk about in this course and in the books that you're going to be reading. The first is an event. An event is defined as an observable occurrence on a system or network. So there's no connotation, positive or negative, regarding to an event. So most events are going to be positive, and we're not going to have to be concerned with them. However, an adverse event is one that would have negative consequences. Now, what would negative consequences be? It could be one of several things, and on the next couple of slides we'll actually talk about negative consequences with respect to confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of systems. And then within each of those types of incidents, there's various examples that we can talk about. Acceptable use policies, and what these do is they outline the types of uses, the types of things that you can do with the system, and that are considered acceptable by the organization that's providing you that service. And the reason we have these is that what we're trying to do, what these organizations are trying to do, is to identify and define things that would be acceptable for a user to use the systems for. And of course, if we think about, let's say, an acceptable use policy for Gmail, some of the things that may not be considered acceptable would be the use of Gmail for spamming other people, for sending threatening letters or emails, or for storing any types of child pornography on the system, or distributing that child pornography on the system. And of course, if you read any acceptable use policy, there's always consequences for not following the acceptable use policies as defined by the organization. And for many organizations, for example, with the free services such as Yahoo and Gmail, that would be a removal of your account, removal of your privileges. However, in a university setting, you may find the same thing, because universities are typically more wide open. They're more lenient in the things you can do with the system, although none of the things that I just mentioned, distribution of child pornography or spamming other people, would be acceptable to a university. But in an organization, you even have more stringent policies. For example, some of the most stringent email policies might be that you're not allowed to use the email for personal reasons. And if you do, you run the risk of losing your job or losing some other privilege that you might have had you not done what you did. So let's talk a little bit about standard security practices. One that you're probably most familiar with is that you must change your password every so often, either 30 or 60 days. A related matter is that some organizations require that your password be of a certain length minimum, such as 8 characters, and that perhaps it may have to include both upper and lowercase letters, and perhaps a number and or special character. If we don't follow those standard security practices, it could lead to a security incident. For example, somebody being able to guess your passwords and being able to gain access to the system. Now, there's 3 important information security principles, and if you've taken my courses before, you know that there's a couple of others, but these are the ones that are considered the basis for information security. The first is confidentiality. That is, only authorized users are allowed to view certain information. And so some of the security controls that we use are specifically geared to maintaining the confidentiality of information. For example, with the bank, there's certain information that we wouldn't allow outsiders, those not employed by the bank, to be able to view, such as credit card information or other personal information. And in fact, not everybody should be allowed, let's say within an organization, to view the same information. You have a need to know. So, for example, those who are higher up in management or those who work in credit card services may have access to that credit card information, while others working in different parts of the organization may not have it. So you need certain types of controls that would allow certain users authorized access to that information and keeping other people out. Then we have integrity, and there's a couple of different types or definitions of integrity. One is that it's internally consistent. That is, if this information shows up in one place, that it should be the same in all other places. Another definition is that information should be free from unauthorized changes. So, for example, if somebody gains access to certain types of information, let's say at a bank again, and they're able to, for example, to add money into their account, this would be an example of an unauthorized change. And so we want to be able to have controls on that so that the information remains internally consistent and accurate as it should be. And finally, availability is defined as the resource or the service is available for use when needed. And a prime example of an attack against availability is the distributed denial of service attack. And if you've been reading on the internet, there's been a lot of websites, and primarily online gambling sites that have been the subject of extortion attempts or blackmail attempts, if you will, where hackers will contact the people in charge of the casinos, in charge of these websites, and indicate that they're going to bring this websites down through a distributed denial of service attack if they don't pay so much money. And if they don't pay the money, then they're attacked by the attackers. And of course, then it's up to the person who's the manager of the casino to determine whether it's preferable to pay a $5,000 or $10,000 or $50,000 bounty once, or to lose hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue by not acquiescing to the hackers' demands. So that's an intentional attack against the availability of the system. But also there's things, realize that this doesn't necessarily have to mean that the problem with availability is intentional. It could be an unintended consequence. For example, if a building contractor comes in and accidentally cuts through the power plane of the electricity that's running the servers, you still have servers that are down. So it doesn't really matter whether somebody's attacking it and the server's down for a week, or somebody cuts through the power and it takes them a week to get back up. You've still lost the same amount of revenue. So there's certain controls that should be used to actually counter both of those types of threats, and it's something that you need to be considerate of. So what are examples of some incidents, some negative consequences for computer security? The one that we think about a lot is malicious code. And malicious code, also known as malware, includes things like viruses, worms, logic bombs, and Trojans. And actually, Trojan should be with capital T, because that stands for Trojan horse. The second is a denial of service. And a denial of service is when a network service is overwhelmed with a tidal wave of packets. Later on, we'll talk about different types of denial of service, one of which is called a Smurf attack. The other is called a SYN flood. Each of these is essentially sending a tidal wave of packets to a particular server, and it has so many packets with which to deal that it actually can't cope not only with those, but also with the valid users who are attempting to use the services of the server. Then you have unauthorized access, which is defined as accessing information or systems which a user is not authorized to use. And of course, we have controls against for this type of security incident with respect to having access controls that allow certain users access to certain information, and also making sure that authorized users must authenticate to the service before they're allowed to use that. And one of the things I'd like for you to look up on the web, and if you don't know this term, is something called social engineering. And social engineering is not really a technical vulnerability, but it's actually a human vulnerability. It's when one person tries to gain access to a system by gathering information from a registered user, such as their password and username, and usually that's done by pretending to be somebody that they aren't. That is, the attacker pretends, for example, to be administrative assistant and may call the assistant administrator and say that the manager demands that their password be changed to a certain thing because they can't get into the system. And if the system administrator thusly changes that password, then the attacker would be able to gain access to the system. And finally, there's inappropriate usage, such as browsing for porn on your lunch hour or installing and using P2P for file sharing are good examples of inappropriate usage. But you might also consider inappropriate usage is really defined by the organization, and that's set as a part of the acceptable use policy. So if you're in a university and you go to the library and you browse porn on your lunch hour, that may not be considered inappropriate usage. However, for some organizations, they don't want that to occur at their organization, so they would set that as part of their acceptable use policy. So when we're talking about incident response, we're talking about the capability of responding to an incident, and that means firstly identifying the incident and then being able to cope with it. And in order to do this, it can't be done in an ad hoc fashion. That is, wait until the incident occurs and then come up with an ad hoc solution. Ideally, you should have a systematic plan response to all different types of incidents. And let's go back to this page and let's talk about that. So we would have a planned response to any malicious code that shows up on our servers or workstations in an organization. We would have a planned response to a denial of service, because a response to a denial of service is going to be nothing like what you would do to malicious code. They're just different contexts, and they involve different types of problems. Unauthorized access. You're going to want to have a systematic plan for dealing with unauthorized access and for inappropriate usage. And each of those should have their own plan that is separate and distinct from the others. So your incident response plans should contain the following. 1, a quick response with listing the appropriate steps that are needed to be taken. This will assist personnel to recover quickly, minimizing the loss or theft of information or disruption of services. And we also want to be able to learn from the response. What went right, what went wrong, and what could we do to make sure that incident doesn't occur again. And finally, we want to make sure that we deal appropriately with legal issues, because some of these types of incidents we may want to report to authorities. And some, for example, if someone's downloading child pornography, we were mandated by law enforcement to contact them. However, browsing for porn on lunch hour is not in and of itself against the law, at least not in the United States. However, because it's against acceptable use policy, we would want to deal with that. And so, with respect to dealing with legal issues, we want to know beforehand the person that we should contact should an incident rise to the level of something being illegal. And in fact, it's very important to know people in law enforcement beforehand. If you're working in an organization, know who that you should contact, because then if you've got a relationship with those people, then they're more likely to quickly help you should you need their assistance. And so when we're talking about an incident response capability, the first thing we need to do is to establish policies and procedures. Because let's flip back once again up here, if we don't define browsing for porn on lunch hour or installing and using P2P for file sharing is unacceptable, then there's not a whole lot we can do about it in a legal sense. That is, in terms of firing the person, letting them go should they violate the acceptable use policy. So you should think very systematically and clearly about what you want to include in your acceptable use policy to make sure that it covers all of your bases. And you want to include things in there that not only protect you legally, but also protect your business. Because, for example, a P2P file sharing, in fact, there was a case recently in Washington, D.C., where there was a server in a basement that contained thousands and thousands of movies, and this was a governmental agency, and the people who were actually in charge of these servers had to end up buying more hard drive space and more servers so they could download more of these illegal movies. Now, of course, that is against the law, but also it has an impact on the business because you're using the business's funds for things that could be used for something that would actually make them money. And you would also want to have security policies, security practices, and finally you would want to have an incident response plan for each type of incident that could occur in your organization. You also want to be careful that you establish guidelines for communicating with outside parties, including law enforcement, including others in organizations, for example, that may be related to you. For example, your business partners. If you have a business VPN set up between various business partners, if you are the victim of a worm attack, then those worms could actually travel over the VPNs. Therefore, you would want to have guidelines for communicating with people who may be affected by your attacks. And then, of course, you want to select a team structure for your incident response teams. And typically, that's going to be constituted of your systems administrator and perhaps, in the best of all worlds, management, because those are the people who make the business decisions, and anything you do on the technical side may have an impact on the business function. You also want to establish relationships between the incident response team and internal, external relations. If you think about it, if you enlarge your organization, let's say a major bank, you would probably want to have an established relationship with somebody in public relations, because it may be necessary to actually come out and to provide the public with information should that be required. And so by having that pre-established relationship, you're able to do that in a more effective and efficient manner. For example, if somebody broke in and was able to steal hundreds of thousands of credit cards and personal information, you would want to have a way to effectively and efficiently contact all those people to inform them, so that you are showing due care and due diligence with respect to your business function. You'd want to determine what services the incident response team should provide. There could be small incidents that could be handled by the system administrator alone. However, a larger incident, such as a worm attack or a distributed denial of service attack, may be something that would require the services of the entire incident response team. And then you'd want staff and training for the incident response team's members. Dealing with incidents is something you can either learn by trial and error, learn on the job, but it's something that's best that you're trained for in advance. Because if you're learning by trial and error, then that means that you're losing a lot of your business function while you're learning by trial and error, and sometimes it can be the downfall of a business. Is a single incident. What are some of the outcomes? If we're learning from incidents, because if we find that we're attacked by a worm or distributed denial of service attack or unauthorized use of a computer, not only should we stop that immediately, as quickly as we can, but also learn from the incident, why it occurred. And by learning from the incident allows us to be proactive in the future to provide security services. So we want to consider, the physical security of the system, the network security, the security of the workstation, as well as user training. As I indicated on a previous slide, an incident could be an intentional act, or it could be an unintentional act. So if a user accidentally deletes an entire set of backups, does it really matter whether that's intentional or unintentional? In the end, it really doesn't matter, because the backups are gone, and therefore it's going to have an impact on the organization regardless. And of course, we need to be prepared, have a plan. We have to have an incident response plan, one for each type of incident, because those are the blueprints for dealing with incidents. What that allows us to do is to think carefully about an incident and not make mistakes that we might make if we just went in an ad hoc fashion and tried to resolve the problems with the incident in real time. Okay, that ends this brief soliloquy on an incident response overview. Our next iClass will involve talking about different types of incidents that may occur.